Awesome. Good morning and welcome to today's webinar, Securing and Recovering Active Directory from Cyberattacks. My name is Mark Leavenworth and I'm the IRM Education and Outreach Coordinator for DIR, or the Texas Department of Information Resources. Today's webinar is hosted by Cymperis as part of the Technology Today series, which is an ongoing series of educational events. The Technology Today series runs year-round and is sponsored by DIR. Look for additional upcoming educational opportunities in the events section of the DIR website. Today's presentation will be recorded. We're going to make that recording available to attendees. After the webinar, we're going to send a follow-up email with an IRM continuing education form that's going to serve as proof of attendance and an event evaluation. Please take a moment to share your feedback, as this helps us improve our events. Okay, I'm excited to get started. I'm going to hand things over to Sean Doobie. I want to say thank you so much to the Cymperis team for hosting today's presentation. Good morning, Sean.
Good morning, Mark. Thank you. And thanks to everybody for making it this morning. As obviously, my name is Sean Doobie and my title is Principal Technologist North America for Cymperis. Cymperis is a company focuses on identity and specifically hybrid identity, resilience, and recovery. And what we're going to talk about today, or what I'm going to talk about today, is really centered on identity and the importance of identity. My background, I like to joke that I've been doing Microsoft identity as long as Microsoft has been doing identity. So I was up here in Dallas. I was with Texas Instruments. I rolled out, if you remember, Windows NT. I rolled out Windows NT for Texas Instruments around the world. And then I went to Intel, where I was one of the architects of Intel's Active Directory, and then ran it for 10 years, ending up as the guy leading its strategic direction. So I've done a bunch of other stuff, technology journalism, which is a ton of fun. And I still do a lot of writing and consulting on hybrid Microsoft strategies. So on-prem, Azure AD, as it was called at the time, now Entra ID, love the marketing stuff. And come back full circle to Active Directory and on-prem and hybrid identity, because it's so important and it's become so important today. I have at my feet, I have one of my dogs sleeping peacefully. So let's all hope that we don't have a trash truck go by, or I'm going to jump on mute in a hurry. So what am I going to talk about? I'm going to talk about the importance of identity to modern security, how it has become central to modern security, and then as a result of that, how often it is attacked, what the landscape looks like, what is the situation for identity attacks and the vulnerability of identity today, and then how they're protecting identity in a way that is different than some of the traditional methods that you may have heard of. And then finally, about the difficulty when Active Directory is attacked, because it's not if Active Directory is attacked, it's when, the difficulty that you may not be aware of in bringing it back to a trustworthy state. So that's what I'm going to talk about. Let me head into it a little bit. So it says it right there. Identity is fundamental to modern security. If you're having difficulty sleeping some evening and you need a little bit of assistance, I recommend you pull up the NIST implementing a zero trust architecture document and start reading through that. That will help any insomnia issues you have. But before my head hit the pillow, I did see this phrase in there, which is straight out of the document. It says enhanced identity governance, which by that they mean identity systems with governance wrapped around it, identity lifecycle, attribution, all that sort of good thing that everybody likes to do, but it's hard to do. Enhanced identity governance is seen as the foundational component of zero trust architecture. Not a fundamental component, but the fundamental component. There are other pieces, certainly, in creating a zero trust architecture, but identity is really at the core of it. Gartner says that identity is central to providing appropriate, accurate, and secure access to data, services, and systems. And I can tell you, I've been going to identity conferences for 15, 20 years, and I watched them grow and grow and grow as people realize how important identity is in the modern world. For security, we can't rely on boundaries anymore. We can't rely on traditional network boundaries. It's about identity boundaries. With that said, cyber attacks start with identity compromise. This is really kind of the modus operandi, and I've had an opportunity to talk with several individuals in the last few weeks from Microsoft's DART organization. That's their detection and response team. That's their incident response team that goes to their highest paying, their top tier customers, including nations. They're the people that get involved when a threat actor gets into some Microsoft environments. And that's what they say. And on a related team, Alex Weinert, who is the vice president of identity security at Microsoft, which puts him in charge of all of the cloud security from Entra ID, formerly known as Azure Active Directory, Xbox, Microsoft Consumer, billions of accounts. He says that more often than not, attacks like ransomware are actually the second stage. It's the identity compromise that happens first. In fact, if you read all the attention-grabbing headlines, and a lot of us do, if you read between the lines, you'll find that most of these attacks rely on compromising identity first. And of course, this is cliche, but it's so true, is that attackers don't break in, they log in. 84% of organizations that reported an attack last year said that it was identity focused. Alex also had this great quote. You probably all seen the press and got into various levels of details on the SolarWinds incident, especially being an Austin-based company, probably lots of press on it. But the press on it was really focused on the SolarWinds malware, how SolarWinds Orion got compromised and injected malware into it. But Alex, who was on the bleeding red line for Microsoft when this was going on, he was reporting to Satya Nadella, the CEO, every day for 2 months on this. He said that really wasn't the center of it all. It was just one of many mechanisms they used to get in. In fact, what he said was that most of the organizations that he contacted personally had their on-premises Active Directory completely compromised by the nation state actors before they were compromised by SolarWinds. So he said this attack was a demonstration of how central identity is when you're attacking infrastructure. So when you look at identity and you look at different vulnerabilities that threat actors attack, you find that some vulnerabilities are targeted more than others. So on the left-hand side of the screen here are these are the by different verticals like network techniques and AWS techniques, how many vulnerabilities there are, proportion of organizations that have vulnerabilities in these areas. So 88% of organizations have vulnerabilities that are vulnerable to network techniques to get around. But on the right-hand side is how many exposures actually happened. So even though 88% of organizations are vulnerable to network techniques, only 1% of the time were network techniques used to compromise the organization. So you can see the same thing for IT services. 85% have vulnerabilities related to their IT services, but only 8% were compromised. However, look at Active Directory. 82% of organizations have Active Directory vulnerabilities, and 82% of organizations had their Active Directory targeted. Pretty telling. That's where the bad guys go. Active Directory it's the highway for the threat actors to get into and get through an organization. So what does that mean? It means that if Active Directory isn't secure, nothing is secure for any number of reasons. First off, AD is the de facto identity system in almost all medium and large size organizations. It's around 90% or so, and it's been that way for a long time. When I participate in other webinars, I will ask the question, how many of you have an exit strategy for Active Directory, that it's going to be going away? In 1 year, 2 year, 5 years, or never. And remarkably, every time about 75% say never. Not going away anytime soon. Pretty amazing for a technology that is coming up on a quarter century old and has actually become more important than it was 10 years ago, because it's the basis for hybrid identity, where you have, like this simplified picture, you've got Active Directory on premises, and then you've got a cloud identity provider such as Entra ID, which is Azure Active Directory, or perhaps Okta or Google G Suite, which you then use to access SaaS applications like Office 365 or AWS or Salesforce. AD is more important than ever. And because, as I said, the zero trust model depends on identity, and identity for Entra ID is sourced out of Active Directory, that means it assumes that Active Directory integrity is important. So security starts with Active Directory, even more so in the hybrid world that we live in today. Now, I mentioned I've had a chance to talk with several individuals from Microsoft's DART incident response team. And this is what they say in their literature on their website, that when Microsoft incident response is engaged, in most engagements, threat actors have taken full control of Active Directory, total domain compromise. Mandiant, the other big dog in the incident response area, says that 90% of attacks that they investigate for their clients involve Active Directory in some form, whether Active Directory is the actual and final attack, or is it just used to go through and get into other resources, or to establish persistence when you think the threat actor is gone, and then they pop up again a month later or 2 months later. When I've had the chance to talk with many CISOs over the last few years, and they pretty much universally say 90% is low. We see it almost 100% of the time when we look through our pen testing reports. So what do the bad guys do? And this is just a few examples of Active Directory's role in attacks against Texas agencies. These are the only ones that I could get clear attribution that Active Directory was involved. But of course, there are many more attacks against Texas agencies. And so if you take that 95% ratio, that tells you with very clearly there are many more than that. This is just a subset that I was able to get clear attribution. So back in 2019, the coordinated ransomware attack on Texas municipalities. They leveraged vulnerabilities in the managed service provider systems. So they did a supply chain attack. Texas Department of Transportation. I'm sure you're all aware of that one. The attackers exploited Active Directory to move laterally within the network and deploy the ransomware. That is a classic attack chain. Texas court system. The attackers used compromised credentials. So this is initial access. They got compromised credentials from a phish or maybe harvested on the dark web to access the court system's Active Directory, allowing them to deploy the ransomware across multiple systems, which means that they probably use group policy in Active Directory to deploy the ransomware. And then the city of Dallas, that was definitely a big deal up here in Dallas. And they said in their incident report, they said that Royal's initial access used the basic service domain service account connecting to a server. Royal was unable to traverse the internal city infrastructure during the surveillance period using legitimate third-party remote access tools. So they compromised a service account in Active Directory. It's possible that they used a technique called Kerberoasting, which is a very popular technique to get credentials of an Active Directory service account, which then allowed them to do a lot of things. As I said, this is just the tip of the iceberg. There were many, many more attacks on Active Directory and Texas agencies. So we talk about identity attacks and what about identity defense? Gartner in the last 2 years or so has come out with a new category in cybersecurity called identity threat detection and response. I've finally gotten used to thinking of ITDR as identity threat detection and response and not IT disaster recovery. But there you go. They came up with a category, they get to name it. And specifically what ITDR is about is correct and secure operation of the identity infrastructure, which is different than protecting the individual users managed by the infrastructure. In other words, ITDR is about defending the identity systems. It's not about finding where credentials have been loaded on the dark web. It's not about frontline issues related to identity. It's about protecting the identity infrastructure and how it works. And the identity infrastructure that everybody has is Active Directory. So they say further that AD, threat detection and response tools, so this is a subcategory of ITDR, which is Active Directory threat detection and response, fulfill this mission by discovering indicators of exposure and indicators of compromise in Active Directory. Indicators of exposure being vulnerabilities in your Active Directory environment that threat actors could compromise, and indicators of compromise, meaning that this has potential for threat actors have already compromised the environment. So that's ITDR. And the immediate question that comes up when talking about ITDR is, how does ITDR compare to EDR? In other words, endpoint detection and response. The software that you put on your endpoints, your PCs, your servers to protect against malware and look for malicious activity. So by way of doing that, I've created a slide that points out in the framework of a cyber kill chain where the two fit. So first thing that you have in the chain is initial client access. And as I said before, not all, but a strong majority of attacks against organizations and agencies come from identity. Approximately, I just read some statistics that said about a third can be from unpatched vulnerabilities, but the majority tend to be from identity. So here you have attacks like, let me go from the bottom up. So you have a brute force attack that you're probably familiar with. Threat actor gains knowledge of an individual user account, and then they hammer it trying to find the password. That is more easily detected than some other methods. Then you have phishing, which, as we all know, is very, very popular. And because let's face it, we humans are the weak point in all of this. That continues to be a very, very successful method for gaining credentials. Single factor VPN, so exposed to the internet, user ID and password, no MFA on it, no extra factor on it. So this is proved, and from me talking to my Microsoft colleagues, this is a very popular method for compromising an organization. Breach replay, where you've given credentials have been compromised from a breach, and then those credentials are used to get in. And finally, password spray, which is sort of a brute force attack turned upside down. So in a brute force attack, you'll have one user one user account that is hammered for a bunch of different passwords. In a password spray attack, you have many accounts, and the threat actor attempts to log in using a common password. Summer 2024 exclamation point, that sort of thing. And that is a very successful method that's being used nowadays. Once they're in, you have what's considered to be the classic cyber kill chain: local escalation on a client, reconnaissance through the network, propagation through the network, escalation for privileges, and which now also in a hybrid world includes escalation up to a cloud service provider such as Entra ID, Azure Active Directory. And then once they have control of the environment, they go to the databases, they exfiltrate the data that they want, and then as they're way out the door, they'll encrypt the environment. This is what's called a double extortion. They are extorting you, one, for a key to decrypt the environment, and two, to not reveal the data, your sensitive data on a dark website. So that's what it looks like in a key chain, in the kill chain. So where does ITDR and EDR fit in this kill chain? EDR fits especially in this front end. It's not entirely that, there's definitely overlap, but at a high level, this is what we're talking about. So EDR does its best work in preventing intrusions into endpoints. As we say, this initial access, unusual behavior, dropping malware on PCs or dropping malware on servers. This EDR's realm, to think endpoint. ITDR, Identity Threat Detection and Response, fits into the middle here, where you're looking at the identity system. You're looking at indicators of exposure and indicators of compromise that show the threat actors that have typically come in from an endpoint. They have propagated around until they can find privileged credentials that they can then use to escalate and get control of Active Directory. Once they have control of Active Directory, they have control over every system that depends upon Active Directory in the environment. SQL Server, SharePoint servers, file servers, all sorts of databases. Not everything, but pretty much everything in the environment that counts. So that's where they fit. ITDR protecting the identity system, and that also includes, and you'll see in here, that also includes Entra ID, Azure Active Directory identity system as well, which is completely out of the bounds of endpoint detection and response systems. So what I've sort of laid out is, look, identity is central to security. Active Directory is central to identity and therefore central to security. And then the bad guys always attack Active Directory. 1, 2, and 3. Now what I wanted to do is a just slight digression to quantify the impact of what that means in most organizations' environments. And that's by doing a simple risk analysis. A risk analysis is a great way to order your priorities of what should be looked at. And I'll throw it out and I'll give an example, and then we'll apply it to Active Directory. So in a classic risk analysis, basically you determine a risk level of an event by the vulnerability or vulnerabilities associated with that system times the likelihood of a threat that exploits the vulnerability times the magnitude of impact from that event. So a practical example that you can all relate to is the risk of a data center power outage. So let's plug some things in. What is the vulnerability to a power cut, to a power outage? Well, it turns out that it's pretty low because data centers, by and large, have all mitigated that risk by having a battery backup or a diesel backup generators in case that happens, times the likelihood of a cut, which is low because service providers take extra efforts to make sure that data centers don't get power outages, times the impact of the power outage if it actually happens, which is very high. Obviously, a whole data center going down, that's a very high impact. So what you get is low times very high, which is low to moderate risk. Now let's look at that for Active Directory. We plug the numbers in, we see that the risk equals Active Directory vulnerabilities times the likelihood of a cyber incident involving those Active Directory vulnerabilities times the impact of an Active Directory outage. So what does that actually mean? So if we look at the risk to your organization, the number of Active Directory vulnerabilities is quite high. If any of you have run our free community tool called Purple Knight is, and I'll put up a little post for it a little bit further on the line. Purple Knight is a free tool that is a Active Directory security analysis tool, and Entra ID as well. It looks for approximately 150 different vulnerabilities in your Active Directory environment. And we have seen, as I said, 30,000 organizations have downloaded them. We don't see the results, but a lot of them have chosen to share the results with us. And what we have found is many organizations get not a very good score on their vulnerabilities because they have so many vulnerabilities. If you think about your organizations and your Active Directory, how long have they been in production? How many changes have been made in production that maybe were not the most secure because you had to get something done? So you take that and you add it up cumulative over the years, and pretty much everybody's Active Directory out there has a lot of vulnerabilities. So that's a high. Then the likelihood of incidents involving Active Directory, we've already seen 90+%, so that's a high. Times the impact of an Active Directory outage, very high. If your Active Directory is offline, people can't log into the network, your applications don't work, maybe even your communications don't even work. And I've added one more variable in there, which is the amount of time, the impact related to the amount of time it takes to get AD back up again, which, as I'm about to show you, is considerable. That's also very high. So what you have is a high, and two very highs. So it's bad. So basically, the risk that Active Directory poses to your environment and your availability, your organization's resilience is very high, very, very high. Take that away and remember that and look into it. So let's talk about that a little bit. We said the risk is very high. Well, what happens? What happens in that environment if Active Directory is attacked? This is an attack timeline from one of our very, very large partners, specifically their data protection team. And what they do is they come into an incident and work with their customers to restore data if it's been encrypted or if they've been involved in a cyber attack. And last I talked to them, they were involved in more than 100 incidents, and they'd put together this timeline based on their experience in incidents. And so number one, what they have found is that there's an average of 21 days to get very, very basic IT functionality working again, just the very, very basic, and 1 to 3 months to fully reestablish the production environment. And you can see the various amounts of time in here. You see the dwell time of 207 days. That's the amount of time that malware sits in your network. I've seen malware vary back and forth from dwell times from a few hours to 207 days, but it's definitely, by and large, it's more than just a few days. But the point on this slide is right here. When they talk about rebuilding things in the environment, the rebuild of Active Directory functionality is what takes the longest. So of 21 days average, they found that it took up to 14 of those 21 days to rebuild Active Directory. And remember, the whole organization is down while this is happening. There's basically almost nothing going on while Active Directory is down in your environment. So what happens to Active Directory when it's been attacked? it's more complex than you may think. So the obvious level is that if you think that there's malware on the domain controllers, you can't trust the servers because they've got malware on them. You got to figure out what the malware is. You have to try and get the malware off it and make sure that it stays off of it. This is complicated by the fact, and obviously the quick answer is, oh, we'll just restore them from backups. Right. Well, you have to figure out how far back those backups go that you don't have the malware on it. And we just said the dwell time could be even beyond the length of your backups. There's another complication that unless you're a real in the dirt AD guy, that you probably are not familiar with, and that is that useful Active Directory backups are only worth about 2 weeks work, only go back about 2 weeks. This is because there are so many changes that go on in Active Directory under the covers. There's some stuff that you're aware of, but there's a lot that you are not aware of, that the further back you go, the more and more difficult it is to put Active Directory back together again. This is especially complicated if you have a hybrid environment where you have a footprint in Entra ID or Okta Azure Active Directory, because the synchronization between on-prem Active Directory and Entra ID are very, very complex. It's almost as complex as recovering Active Directory itself. So you want the very, very shortest backup lifetime. You want to be able to recover from it very, very quickly. So what that means is that conventionally restored domain controllers will have malware on them. It's pretty much a good statement right there, that you recover for Windows using Windows Server Backup or a traditional backup and recovery provider. The domain controllers will have malware on them. That's one issue you've got to take care of. The other, and this is not as well appreciated, is that the Active Directory service itself can't be trusted. If a bad guy, a threat actor, has dropped malware onto your domain controller, they required administrative rights in Active Directory to be able to put that malware there. That means that they may have tampered with the integrity of Active Directory itself, added themselves to a privileged users group is an obvious one, but there are many other subtle ways that are not even logged in the environment that a threat actor can establish persistence. So you may think he's gone, but in the future, they can bring them back up again. This is an indicator of compromise or an indicator of attack. You don't know. So what that means is that the basis of your whole network integrity, your network security, your organization security, that Active Directory is so critical to, suddenly you can't trust it now. So those are two very important aspects to think about. I mentioned, and I won't dwell on this, if you'll pardon the expression, I won't dwell on this, but essentially this is about a little more detail about Active Directory having a very short shelf life. So large Active Directory forests generate tens of thousands of changes daily. So a very large one, much larger than probably most of the organizations here, American Airlines, they generate almost 60,000 changes in Active Directory every day. So all of these things in AD may move and change, and not just on this side, on the other side, they continue to change, trust change, and what that means essentially is that the older that the backup is, the more that breaks when you try to restore it, and the more that you have to fix and rebuild it. And as I said, the synchronization between Entra ID and Active Directory is very, very complex. So it's a reasonable question to ask, well, why don't we just rebuild Active Directory? Well, I will not get into this detail. I won't dive into detail on this, but let's just put it like this. There are literally hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of access control entries and access control lists in an Active Directory environment that depend upon that instance of Active Directory. And if you recreate Active Directory, it's all gone away. All your permissions, all of your shares, including anything that you may have that is synchronized up into Azure Active Directory, Entra ID. It's a mess, and it's really pretty much, it could be done, but it would take you months and months and months to rebuild it correctly. So what does this mean? So should you find yourself in this position and your domain controllers have been compromised and your Active Directory itself has been compromised, you need to look at what is called Active Directory forced recovery. I call it, this is the process that's been keeping AD administrators up for the last 24 years, because it's not something that you want to have to go through, but it's something that you need to know, and it's something that you need to customize for your environment, because you've seen the risk that an Active Directory compromised attack presents to your organization. So it's a 28-step multi-threaded rebuild process that basically takes apart your Active Directory forest and reduces it down to its smallest essence of one domain controller per domain. And then you do a bunch of reset operations, and then you rebuild it out for capacity piece by piece. It's very complicated. It's very tedious. I went through the process of taking the Microsoft's web document and pulling it into a PDF file. And I threw out the pages that were just, reference things and all that. And I came up with a core process of 43 pages with external references, 27 different external references, to which were procedures in their own. And that brought that out to a 150-page document to do a Microsoft forest recovery. And that's not customized to anybody's environment. That's just the doc off the website. You have to look at this forest recovery process and then apply it to your environment in a procedure. And then you need to go test that procedure. You need to do it in an isolated environment, because you don't want to first figure out how to do this at 2:00 on a Sunday morning when your operations desk calls you to say, hey, we're having a problem with our Active Directory. And don't undersell the fact that this is also happening at 2:00 on the Sunday morning, or maybe it's on a Wednesday afternoon, but most of the team hasn't gotten any sleep since 2:00 on a Sunday morning, and everybody is massively stressed out. This is probably, and going through incident response is probably one of the higher stress experiences of one's IT career. I won't go into any level of detail on this. If you're an Active Directory person, you can look at this and you can say, yeah, right. These are all the things that you'd better already know. You'd better have documented and have them saved someplace that doesn't depend on Active Directory, like a file server on your network. Doesn't do you any good because you can't get to the file server. Does that mean print it all out? Okay, great. Where do you put it then? There's layers and layers of complication on this, because AD integrates everything in the environments, your backups, your synchronization with Active Directory, your hypervisors. It's, AD is at the heart of all of this. What does the forest recovery process actually look like? Looks like this. So these are the 28 steps compressed down to their very, very smallest essence. And you can see on some of these, there are little clocks that are here. So for every domain that you have in the environment, you have to go through these steps. For every domain controller in the environment, you have to go through these steps. And wherever you see a clock is something that may take a long time. So for example, remediate malware. You've got to, while everybody's running around with their hair on fire, you have to go try and find where that malware is. You have to do a process that removes the global catalog and re-adds the global catalog. That's a process that runs internally to Active Directory. You can't control it. You can't speed it up. You can't slow it down. You just have to sit there and watch while the boss is calling you on your cell phone every 15 minutes saying, when is it going to be back up? When is it going to be back up? So it's very error prone, as you can see in this situation, and it requires a lot of staff. I only half jokingly describe it is that you need to have everybody that can spell AD has to be on deck, because you have to have operators in front of computer consoles. You have to be restoring things, rebuilding operating systems. It's very, very complex. And conventional backup and recovery software will only help you in this one step. This is restoring the first domain controller of every domain in your forest. That's where conventional software comes in. That's why our company pairs with we partner with conventional with backup and recovery software vendors, because they recognize that their software does not really handle this specific environment, this specific situation. Very quickly, and I won't go over this very long, this shows sort of what recovering Active Directory would be like. And this is from our own incident response team that came into a compromised environment. They found a compromised Active Directory with a number of threat actors in. They used our Active Directory Forest Recovery tool, ADFR, to take a malware-free backup of Active Directory and pull it into an isolated environment, an isolated network. And at that point, the domain controllers were clean, because that's the way ADFR works, but the Active Directory service itself were still contaminated. So that we ran a vulnerability analysis, and we decided to continue using the compromised AD and instead clean up the Active Directory in the isolated environment. So we used this tool called Purple Night Post Breach and AD hardening, and we cleaned up the offline Active Directory, which was a copy of the production Active Directory, but the threat actors couldn't see it because it was in an isolated environment. And then finally, shut down all of the production domain controllers of the still infected production Active Directory, and then brought the cleaned Active Directory back into production. So very complicated to do indeed. This is a little more complicated than some, but still quite possible. So one more aspect in terms of risk is around Entra ID. And again, Entra ID, Azure Active Directory. This is important as well, because organizations think, well, Microsoft has got it. Microsoft has got it taken care of in Entra ID. The reality is they're responsible for the infrastructure of Entra ID. They are not responsible for the data. So this picture comes from a web page called the Shared Responsibility Model on the Microsoft page. There's the URL right there. This is the graphic for it. And it shows what Microsoft is responsible for, and it shows what the customer is responsible for. And I want to point out several things. Documentation of known good states. What that means is if you have users and groups, and your groups have a certain number of users, or they have licenses associated with them, all that, those are the known good states. What Microsoft is saying here is write down the configuration or export the configuration where it's exportable, because if you lose the tenant and somebody messes with it, or if you inadvertently make a change to the tenant, maybe running a script or just mucking around in it, we can't restore it. The only thing that you can do is go back to your documentation and rebuild it on the documentation. The same thing for data retention. Data retention. So Microsoft has this soft delete capability for users, Office 365 groups, and applications. That's it. If you delete security groups, if you delete distribution lists, if you delete conditional access policies or roles, Microsoft can't restore that for you. And the same thing here, there it is, it spells it out, restoring prior configuration. So the way I look at it is, imagine if your Entra tenant was your car parked in the driveway, and somebody steals your car, threat actor gains control or a rogue administrator, disgruntled employee, whatever. And they make a bunch of changes into your Azure Active Directory, into your Entra ID that is not recoverable. That's called a hard delete. Only the objects that I mentioned have a soft delete, and that's only good for 30 days. If it's after 30 days, those are hard deleted as well. You can't recover them. You must rebuild them from your documentation. It's like the police recovering a stolen car and bringing and saying, okay, here's your car back. Someone set a fire in the back seat. Someone had their dog do their business in the front seat. Not the police's responsibility. It's not Microsoft's responsibility. They'll get the tenant back, but the state of the tenant is up to you. I think it is a big deal, and it is not at all clear on that situation to most people. So for key takeaways, this is what I want you to come away with. Number one, Active Directory is the Achilles heel of IT operational resilience. It's always attacked. It has a lot of vulnerabilities. It's difficult to undo changes to Active Directory. So how many of you have accidentally deleted an OU or run a script that makes changes to user attributes or access control lists? And the recycle bin doesn't help that. It's very difficult to roll back changes. And it's extraordinarily difficult to do a cyber recovery, as I just pointed out. And also that cyber recovery of Active Directory isn't just about bringing the domain controller back, but you actually have to go in and make sure your Active Directory is trustworthy again, that threat actors haven't made changes and introduced vulnerabilities into the environment that they can then come back and take advantage of. And then, as you just saw, your Entra ID data is at risk. You need to look at ways in all of those dialog boxes where it says export, to export those configurations. And where there isn't, I mean, take screenshots, do whatever you need to do to have some kind of documentation of what the environment is. I recommend a free tool. This is the Purple Knight that I was talking about before. It says 20,000 downloads. I just learned recently it's closer to 30,000 downloads. Many security indicators. It will give you a score. Here's Active Directory. Here's Azure Active Directory. Here's Okta. It will give you a score of how many vulnerabilities you have, because you will have them, and how critical they are, and order them in criticality and also fit them in the MITRE ATT&CK framework. So you can see, is it to establish persistence? Is it initial access? Is it escalation? Where they fit in the environment, and give you guidance on how to reduce your attack surface. It won't just tell you you have an insecure Kerberos delegation. It will give you steps to show you how to make it more secure. So my call to action for you is to mitigate the risk associated with your hybrid Active Directory cyber recovery. Entra ID, Active Directory. Go and look at the forest recovery process. Build yourself a forest recovery procedure and then go test it. You also have to look into forensics and threat actor detection in your Active Directory. Again, trusting this service. And as I said in the previous page, look at what it takes for Entra ID. So the synchronization, if you look at on-premises Active Directory and Entra ID, they're designed to sort of act as a synchronized whole. And once you start messing with one without paying attention to the other, you run into some serious synchronization problems. Consider looking at automated solutions to reduce impact of an AD outage. Everything I've showed you takes time. And when Active Directory is down, time is money. Thousands of dollars an hour, hundreds of thousands of dollars an hour, depending on the organization. So, and finally, look at automation tools to back up your Entra ID objects as well. The backup story for Entra ID is a mess, to not put it too fine a point. There is no centralized backup API for Entra ID like there is for Windows Server and Active Directory. It's very piecemeal. So the more automation you can apply to this, the better setup that you'll be for that. Finally, a little self-promotion. I forgot to mention, as I always forget to do, so I have a podcast on identity. It's called the Hybrid Identity Protection Podcast. You can see a little bit of the logo right there. I can't push it down anymore because it will knock my monitor over. But the HIP podcast, I've got an interview coming up with a Microsoft Dart representative that talking about how identity attacks happen in the environment. I've got many interviews in the back about identity security. And in November, we have the Hybrid Identity Protection Conference at Mardi Gras World in the French Quarter, New Orleans, November 13th and 14th. And we'll have folks like Alex Weinert, who I quoted, our Vice President of Identity Security. We'll have Chris Inglis, the former cyber director, the first cyber director for the White House of the US, and former chief operating officer of the NSA. Chris is a strategic advisor to our company. And a number of other very high profile speakers and really, really knowledgeable speakers to help you build your Active Directory expertise, because this is a conference about knowledge and about building up your knowledge for Active Directory and Active Directory security. So I'm done. We have a few minutes for questions, and of course, I'm happy to answer questions after the fact. My name is not Jeffrey Pitts. Jeffrey Pitts is the person there. There's Jeffrey Pitts. And thanks for your time. And hopefully you learned something. And hopefully you'll all go rush off and start looking at the Active Directory forest recovery process.
Thank you, Sean. One thing that stood out to me is when you were talking about the Active Directory forest recovery and described it as the boogeyman of Active Directory operations. And then you went through the process. I kind of can see where that nickname is justified. I have a couple questions. I don't see any questions in the Q&A pane, but you have reiterated a couple times how Active Directory is particularly vulnerable in a cyber attack. What is it that makes it different than, say, like a file or a database server?
Well, first off, the fact that it's a distributed system, that's one aspect to it. So most people, hopefully, have more than one Active Directory domain controller. So the nature of Active Directory is the synchronization between them is very important. You can't just, please tell me, or actually don't tell me, that people are using snapshots to back up Active Directory, because that is not a good backup strategy. You can get into a world of hurt if you're trying to recover all of your Active Directory from snapshots. But it's the two-part aspect to it. It's the fact, if it was, let's say it was a file server, what you've got to do is you've got to remove the malware from the file server. Done. You're good. End of story. With Active Directory, because it's the service itself and establishing trust, reestablishing trust when Active Directory has been attacked, it's not just about decrypting a domain controller. And that in itself there's a whole other hour seminar on getting involved in that. But it's about reestablishing trust. And that often takes longer. If you don't have the right tools, that takes longer than simply recovering and scrubbing the malware off the domain controller. So and really, if you find yourself going to that forest recovery process, which is the only way you can absolutely be sure, that you've shown that's what makes it different than a file server. AD is and I have to say, I'm always spend my time beating up AD. AD is an incredible piece of software. If you consider the fact that it's almost a quarter of a century old, it's everywhere. Everybody still depends on it, and it works. It works wonderfully. The drawback is that it was designed, so everybody in the audience think, what were you doing in 1997 and 1998? That's when Active Directory was designed. There was barely any internet at that time, let alone the persistent threat actors. It just wasn't designed to handle these kinds of threats.
And then one more question. Should we be just totally freaking out over the increased sophistication of the attacks that we see? What's the best way to keep up with them?
I think this is a really good question, and it's an important question, because if you follow the trades and you work in IT security, you're reading about this attack, this attack, this attack. And it's like, oh my God, how can I protect my environment against it? And I'm actually writing another self-serving. I'm writing a blog post about this right now from doing these interviews. But the reality is this: if you want to understand, nation state is it's a different thing. And you could, in the government agency, and you could see nation state actors. But for cybercrime actors, if you proceed from the principle that, number one, they want to make as much money as possible, number two, as quickly as possible, and number three, with as little interference from law enforcement as possible, those three tenets, they're not going to use a fancy SolarWinds supply chain compromise if they can literally, one of my Dart guys say, that if they can literally go out to GitHub, download the code on GitHub, buy credentials for some organization off of the dark web, and get in and execute their stuff and make money. They're going to use the simplest way to get in. And sort of what I described to you in that cyber kill chain, that's what they do. They get credentials to get initial access. They get to the point where they can get Active Directory elevated privileged access. They stomp all over your environment. Once they have that, they exfiltrate data, and maybe they'll encrypt it. And then that's what they do. And that's what they do again and again and again. So by protecting your environment, what I call eat your vegetables, people, this is the same old stuff as always. Protect against the low-hanging fruit, the obvious stuff that the bad guys used to get in. Run Purple Knight. It will show you where the things that you need to close. And it may not be perfect, but if you make it difficult enough for the threat actors, I am told, they will go on to somebody else, because there's a universe of poorly secured and organizations out there that they can make money off of.
I think this is very valuable information. We really appreciate having you here to share with us today, Sean. I'd like to thank everyone for joining us. Big thank you to Sean, Jeff, Karina, and the whole team at Cymperis for hosting today's webinar. I'd like to tell our attendees to keep an eye out for a follow-up email with event evaluation and continuing education form. Sean, anything else to share before we wrap?
Just a call to action. Everybody's got Active Directory vulnerabilities. Purple Knight is free. We don't see any of it. It doesn't require any elevated rights in the environment. Just go ahead and run it, and then come to the HIP conference in New Orleans and learn a lot more from the world's top experts in Active Directory.
Sounds like a good plan of action. Thank you again, Sean and Jeff, and thank you for everyone attending today. Hope you have a great day.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.